I had just set my coffee on the table when it came 3 quick, uneven knocks, more like the slap of open palms than a proper knock. No one came this far into the basin in winter unless they were lost or running from something. Outside, the wind drove ice sideways, scouring the boards like sandpaper. Through the crack of the door, I saw her barefoot in the snow hair plastered to her cheeks, white dress torn and muddied from the knees down. She swayed once before catching herself, her breath sharp in the cold air. For a moment, I just held the latch, weighing whether to open wider or close it before trouble stepped inside. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name is Silas Harwood, and for the past 5 years, I've lived alone at the farthest edge of Dry Hollow where the tree line falls away to open snow, and the wind makes a man earn every breath. I built my homestead by hand, post by post after the war, left me with more ghosts than kin. My brother never came home, and the woman who once promised to wait didn't either. That taught me not to look for anyone coming up the trail. Out here, you rise with the frost, mend what's worn, and work until there's nothing left in you but the quiet. The values I was raised on: keep your word, take care of your stock before yourself, never leave a neighbor wanting. They still steer me, though there aren't many neighbors left to practice them on. The townsfolk in Cold Creek live by a different measure now, one tied to silver claims and land deeds, where a man's worth is reckoned in dollars and the size of his holdings. I've never cared for that kind of tally. My wealth's in the soundness of my fences, the yield of my pasture, and the fact that no one tells me when to plant or when to pray. Still, you can't keep to yourself without catching the whispers from town. The railroad's been creeping closer, bringing speculators and mining men who see every acre as something to carve up or sell. Folks like Burke Garrison, who owns half the claims in Cold Creek and half the men along with them. I'd seen the kind of power he wielded, quiet, sharp, and quick to cut. And when I heard his name tied to the trouble that came knocking on my door, I knew it wasn't the sort of trouble that blew over with the next snow. I didn't yet know who she was or why she'd come, only that the cold had hold of her, and the look in her eyes said she'd crossed more than just miles to get here. I stepped back from the door just enough for her to pass the wind, carrying in a swirl of ice behind her. She moved toward the stove without a word, her shoulders tight, her hands stiff from the cold. Outside, the light was already going, and in that dimming hour, I realized something, whatever she was running from, was still close enough to catch her, if I let it. Mara stood near the stove, her back to the room, shoulders drawn tight beneath the wool blanket I'd pulled from the peg. The snow melt on the floor around her boots darkened the plank boards, and each drop seemed to mark how far she'd come from wherever she'd fled. I set my rifle back in its place and crossed to the cupboard, drawing out a basin, a rag, and the jar of salve I kept for cuts and frostbite. She didn't speak when I knelt beside her, only glanced down once as I began to clean the raw scrape along her shin. Her skin was cold under my fingers, but she held still. The tear in her dress told its own story, white silk turned brown with mud, the hem stiff with ice. When the wound was wrapped, I offered her one of my shirts folded and set across the table. She took it in both hands, but kept the blanket over her shoulders. "You're safe here," I said, voice low so it didn't startle her. She met my eyes for a moment, then looked away. The fire popped in the stove, throwing a brief wash of light over her face. I didn't ask questions. A person talks when they're ready, not before. By morning, the snow had eased, though the cold had deepened. The smell of eggs and salt pork filled the cabin, and I set 2 plates on the table. Mara came forward slowly, my shirt hanging loose over her frame, her feet wrapped in strips of linen. She sat without a word. At first she ate in small bites, polite, almost cautious. But the hunger took hold soon enough, and she finished before I'd made it halfway through my own plate. Only then did she speak. "You live out here alone?" I nodded. "Built this place yourself?" Another nod. Her hands tightened in her lap. "I'm not just running away," she said finally. "My uncle owed a man named Burke Garrison more than he could pay. Garrison runs the claims in Cold Creek. My uncle gave me to him in marriage to settle the debt." Her eyes stayed on the table as she went on. "I didn't know until the morning it was to happen. They dressed me like a prize and pulled me out to meet the preacher. I ran before the vows could be spoken." She paused, glancing toward me. "I remembered your face from the trading post. You didn't look at me like the others did." I leaned back slightly. "You're not theirs," I said. "You're still yours." She studied my face, searching for any hint of doubt and finding none. Then she drew the blanket tighter and said, "I can work. I'm not looking for pity. I just need a place to not be found." I told her she'd stay inside until her feet healed, then we'd see. That seemed to be enough for now. The days that followed settled into a kind of quiet order. Mara reshaped her dress into something fit for work, cutting it shorter, patching the bodice with burlap and hemming the edges with strips of wool. The white silk still clung to her shape, but she wore it now, without shame. One morning she followed me to the woodpile without being asked. I handed her a pair of gloves, and we split logs side by side, until the breath showed thick in the air. She wasn't strong, but she learned fast, her swings clean and measured. Back inside, I poured her the larger cup of coffee and slid the last slice of bread her way. She found her own tasks in the days after, sweeping ash from the hearth, mending the curtain, milking the goat, without flinching at the smell or the cold. We didn't speak much, but each small thing she did eased her deeper into the life here. Still at night, I'd find her sitting near the fire after chores, eyes fixed on the dark window. One evening she broke the silence. "I keep thinking he'll come for me. Garrison or my uncle. I don't know which is worse." I told her no one came up here unless they meant to, and if they did, I'd know. She looked at me for a long moment. "Why are you like this? You let me in, feed me, but you barely speak." I told her I used to talk more before the war, before my brother died, before the woman I was to marry left. She nodded and after a while said, "You're not a ghost?" "Neither are you," I said, "no matter what they tried to make of you." The wind rattled the shutters that night, but inside the stove kept steady heat. She worked her needle through a patch on her skirt, and I read by the fire. Now and then she glanced up as if checking I was still there. I didn't move, didn't fill the space with talk. She'd had enough of men who took up all the air in the room. When she finally set the fabric aside, her shoulders eased, and she leaned back in her chair. The clock on the wall ticked out the minutes. The next morning, frost glazed the inside edges of the windows. Mara rose early, her feet still bound but steady enough to cross the yard for water. The sound of the bucket rope creaking over the well pulley carried in the cold air. I watched her from the porch, noting how she no longer glanced over her shoulder every few steps. Later, over coffee, she asked, "Do you ever go into town?" I told her only when I needed to grain kerosene sugar. She stared at her cup a moment. "If folks there know you live alone, they'll talk about me being here." I shrugged. Let them. That night, a windstorm came hard out of the north. Shingles rattled and the goat bleated twice before settling. Sometime after midnight, Mara stepped into the kitchen, her face pale from a dream she wouldn't name. I motioned her to the stove, poured her coffee, and told her she didn't need to explain. She studied the flames and said quietly, "I hated how they looked at me in that dress, like I'd already been claimed." She exhaled slow. I ran before I forgot I could. I told her it was a good choice no matter when she'd made it. Her hand brushed my coat sleeve, then just a light touch, not asking, not clinging. I rested mine over hers for a moment, the firelight flickering across our joined hands. Neither of us spoke. The storm pressed against the walls, but inside the air felt still. When she pulled her hand back, she sat a little straighter, eyes on the fire. I stoked it once more before stepping out to the porch, knowing she'd sleep easier now. The snow would deepen before spring came, and with it the questions of how long she would stay and what trouble might still be on her trail. For now, I only knew this: if a rider came up the basin road, I'd hear him before he reached the gate. And that thought sat solid in my mind as I watched the dark hills beyond the fence line, waiting for whatever the next day might bring. The wind shifted during the night, bringing with it a damp chill that crept through the seams of the cabin. By first light, the sky had turned a flat gray, the kind that promised more cold before any sign of thaw. Mara was already awake, her feet wrapped and steady enough now that she moved from table to stove without hesitation. She had taken to wearing one of my old coats over the patched dress she'd reshaped the hem, no longer dragging the fabric mended where frost and briars had torn it. The sight of her crossing the yard for water no longer carried the same wariness it had in the first days. That morning she followed me to the barn. Her steps crunched lightly in the frozen dirt, the sound sharp in the still air. Inside, the smell of hay and the low snort of the gelding filled the space. She unlatched the stall without needing instruction, fetching the pitchfork and starting on the muck. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her hair was tied back with a strip of linen. I worked at the feed bins, filling buckets with grain, the rhythm of her shovel keeping time with my own movements. When we stepped back out, the frost had begun to lift off the fence rails, a sign the day would stay, just cold enough to hold the ground hard. Later, as we washed at the pump, Mara glanced sideways. "Do you think they're still looking for me?" Her voice was even, but her hand stilled over the rag. I told her maybe, but not this far out. "And if someone does?" she asked. I met her gaze and said simply, "I've buried worse men." She didn't flinch at that, just dried her hands and headed toward the house. The week settled into its pattern. We worked in the daylight, kept the fire through the night, and spoke little outside of what the day's labor required. Still small changes marked the passing time. She no longer asked where she could help, she just stepped in. A sack of oats would appear by the barn door before I went to fetch it. The hearth swept clean before I thought to look. Her presence filled spaces without pressing against them. One evening, a windstorm came out of the west, rattling the shutters and sending fine snow sifting through the eaves. Mara startled awake from a dream, her breath quick. She found me sitting in the chair by the stove rifle within reach, coffee cooling in my hand. "You don't sleep much," she said after a moment. "No." She studied the firelight on the boards. "You're waiting for someone to come?" I didn't answer that directly. She asked, then, "Do you believe me about what I told you?" I said I'd seen enough to know truth when I heard it. That seemed to steady her, though she kept her eyes on the flames. "I thought you'd ask about the wedding," she said after a time. "About what they did. Why I ran. I told her asking wouldn't undo it. If she wanted me to know, she'd tell me." Her shoulders eased a fraction. "I hated how they looked at me in that dress," she said, voice low. "Like I belonged to him before a word was spoken." She drew the blanket closer. "I ran before I forgot I could." I nodded once. That was the right choice, even if it came late. For a long while, the only sound was the fire. Then her hand brushed against my coat sleeve, light enough I might have missed it if I'd moved. I set my hand over hers, no more than a steady weight. The wind pushed at the walls, but inside the air stayed still. When she withdrew her hand, she didn't retreat to the far side of the room. Instead, she sat straight, her eyes fixed ahead. By the next morning, the ice on the inside of the windows had melted back a little. Mara took the needle and thread to my work coat, mending the split along the shoulder. She sat near the window where the light was best, her fingers working slow and sure. I was outside clearing snow from the shed roof, and when I came back in, the coat was laid neatly over the chair. "Seam was about to go," she said without looking up. I checked the stitching, nodded, and told her it was good work. She smiled faintly at that, the kind of smile that comes from being noticed for something worth doing. That night, after the dishes were washed and set aside, she moved her cot closer to the stove without asking. I didn't move it back. She asked about the woman I'd been set to marry before the war, and I told her Ruth had waited through the fighting, but left when I came home changed. Different, how, she asked. Quieter, I said. Easily startled? Less like myself. She thought on that for a moment before saying, maybe she wanted the man she remembered, not the one who survived. I didn't have an answer for that. Mara sat with her hands in her lap for a time before speaking again. When I was 14, a man tried to drag me behind the saloon. I bit him, and my uncle beat me for it. Said I'd ruined my chance to make good on my looks. Her voice didn't shake, but the set of her jaw told the rest. I stopped fighting after that. Started thinking maybe that was just life. I asked if she still believed that. She shook her head. No. She stood then, not quickly, but with purpose, and took the seat beside me on the bench near the fire. Our shoulders touched, and after a time, she let her head rest lightly against my arm. I didn't move away. The fire burned down to coals, and when she finally rose to go to her cot, I took my coat from the peg and laid it over her before returning to my chair. Outside, the wind had gone still, but I kept my place by the fire until the first light showed at the window. Whatever her reasons for coming, Mara was no longer just passing through. She had begun to take root here, even if neither of us had said as much. Still, the basin road was long, and a lone rider could appear at any time. It was the kind of thought that kept a man watchful, even in the quiet hours. And I knew the next change, good or bad, might not be far off. The storms eased toward the end of the month, though the air stayed sharp enough to bite through wool. In the mornings, frost still laced the window glass, but the light lingered longer in the evenings, and the wind carried a damp edge that hinted at change. Mara moved easily through the cabin now. Her steps sure her work quick and quiet. She no longer asked which tasks needed doing. If something was out of place, she saw to it. That morning, we worked side by side, repairing the north fence. I held each post steady while she braced it with both hands, her boots planted firm in the frozen ground. She watched how I set the nails and matched her own rhythm to mine. When we finished, she stepped back and studied the straight line of rails with a small nod. If I'm staying, I want to help with the planting, she said. I told her the ground would be ready soon for potatoes, and she smiled at that, as if it was already settled. Inside, the fire burned low, and the smell of coffee filled the room. We sat across from each other, steam curling from our cups. Her patched dress was fitted closer now, the waist taken in the hem even. It framed her without display, as if she'd decided her shape didn't need hiding. She caught me looking at the stitching along the collar and said, "Cost me 3 broken needles." I grunted approval, and that seemed enough for her. Weeks of working in step had changed the air between us. The silences no longer felt like distances to cross. In the evenings, she mended or read while I carved or oiled tack. Sometimes her hand would brush my arm as she passed, light and unhurried, as if we'd both forgotten to keep that kind of space. One night the wind rose outside, warmer this time, carrying the smell of damp earth. She stood from the table after drying the last dish and paused in the middle of the room. Her eyes went to the bedroom door, then back to me. "I'm tired of sleeping alone," she said, her voice plain and without hesitation. I set down my knife, and the piece of cedar I'd been shaping rose and crossed the room. Without a word, I opened the door. The room was small, the lamplight soft against the walls. She stepped inside first, her fingers brushing the top seam of her bodice. I closed the door behind us. She undressed slowly, letting the fabric fall to the floor in quiet folds. Her skin caught the lamplight warm against the shadowed boards. I stood still until she closed the space between us. When I touched her, It was with the care of a man who would take only what was given, and she met me without flinch or rush. We lay close after the quiet settling like another layer of warmth. Her head rested against my chest, and I felt her breathing slow. No promises were spoken, no questions about what came next. The weight of the moment was enough. When her breathing deepened into sleep, I stayed awake a while longer, my hand resting along her back, listening to the steady crack of the cooling stove. Morning came clear and cold. She rose with the first light moving through the room, as she always did, checking the fire, setting the kettle, folding the blanket at the bed's foot. We shared coffee without speaking of the night before. Outside, the snow crust had softened in patches, and the ground showed dark through the melt. The change of season was slow, but it had begun. We worked the far pasture that day, walking the fence line where the trees dipped low and the snow lingered longer. The ground was still hard under our boots, but in the sunlit breaks, the air felt different. She asked questions about the land, the weather, the animals, not to fill the time, but to know the place better. I answered what I could, glad to hear her voice in the open air. Back at the cabin, she set a small pile of mending on the table, shirts and trousers, worn thin in the same places each season. She worked with the needle while I hauled in the evening's wood. When I returned, she'd already folded the repaired shirt neatly, her fingers brushing over the seam as if sealing the work. The firelight caught the curve of her smile when she looked up, one corner of her mouth lifting before she bent back to her task. That night, she settled into bed beside me without pause. Outside, the wind moved over the ridge, carrying the smell of wet pine. Inside, we lay in the quiet, our breathing in time. Whatever path had brought her here, it seemed she was no longer looking back down it. And though neither of us said it, we both knew the road ahead would bring its own tests. Toward the end of the week, I caught sight of movement far down the basin road. A small figure on horseback, too distant to make out more than the shape. By the time I stepped off the porch, the rider had slowed and turned toward the tree line, disappearing from view. The snow there was unbroken, no sign of fresh tracks when I checked. Still, I kept my rifle leaned within reach that night. The thought of that lone figure staying with me. The thaw came slow, but it came. By the first week of March, the snow had pulled back from the south-facing slopes, leaving the ground wet and dark. The air smelled of mud and pine, and the creek beyond the ridge ran faster with meltwater. Mara and I worked the main plot each morning, breaking the soil with spade and hoe. She kept pace without complaint, her hands blistered but steady. We planted the first rows of potatoes, spacing each cut seed with care, covering them in a thin layer of earth. One afternoon, while I was checking the fence line, she cleared a second shelf in the pantry and began lining it with her things. Spools of thread, the small sewing tin, a wrapped bar of soap she'd traded for in town. She didn't mention it, and I didn't ask. The shelf stayed full after that. At night, she settled into bed beside me, as if it had always been so. Sometimes we spoke in the dark about repairs we'd need to make where the blackberry bushes would ripen come summer. But more often we lay in silence, the steady rhythm of our breathing enough. Toward the middle of the month, I saddled the mare for a trip to Cold Creek. Mara rode behind me, her arms light around my waist, the hem of her blue cotton dress lifting in the breeze. At the general store, she chose a spool of white thread, a tin of coffee, and a pair of shears. I took grain salt and a few pounds of nails. At the counter, the shopkeeper's eyes lingered on her before sliding toward me. "You taking in help?" he asked low. I laid down a silver dollar and waited until he looked away. Outside, Mara mounted without help. As we rode out, she leaned close. "They think you bought me," she said. I kept my eyes on the trail. I didn't. Her arms tightened just slightly. I know. The road home wound through the valley, the late light setting the ridge edges in gold. When we reached the gate, I swung down and turned to help her dismount. She met my eyes, then steady. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. I took her hand and held it a moment before we went inside. The days ran in quiet rhythm until a rider came down the basin road late one afternoon. I spotted him from the porch, a lone figure moving slow, shoulders bent with age. He stopped at the gate and tipped his hat when I came out. "Passing through from Cold Creek," he said. "Brought a message. Name was Garrison. Packed up and left town last week. Ain't no one looking for anybody anymore." I nodded once and took the folded scrap of paper he offered, though it held nothing more than the name. When he rode off, Mara stepped out from the doorway, her eyes on the empty trail. She didn't smile, didn't speak, just stood there until the rider was gone from sight. Inside, she set the paper on the table and sat down across from me. "I think I already knew," she said quietly. "Out there, I was still running. In here, I've been living." I reached across and cupped her face in my hands. When I kissed her, it was without caution. She leaned into it, her fingers gripping my shirt, the warmth of her body close against mine. "I want more than safety," she said when we drew apart. "I want a future." I told her she had both. Later that week, we rode into town again. This time, along with our supplies, we bought a plain silver ring with a small sturdy stone. No preacher, no gathering, just the two of us on the porch at sundown, the fields behind us and the cabin at our backs. "I vow not to let you go," I told her. "I vow to stay," she answered. We didn't need more than that. We went inside together as the light faded the door, closing softly behind us. Outside, the wind moved over the basin, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine, and I knew the next season was already on its way. Spring came on slow but sure. The last of the snow pulled back from the edges of the barn, leaving muddy ruts where the water had run off. The pasture showed patches of green, and the trees along the ridge budded pale against the sky. Mara stood in the doorway most mornings, her hand on the frame, watching the light stretch farther over the field each day. Her steps had grown unhurried, her voice steady when she asked about the work ahead. We kept to a rhythm, turning soil, setting seed, mending the harness, before the plow needed pulling again. She matched my pace, her palms roughened now from the hoe handle. One afternoon, she paused to brush back her hair with the crook of her arm and said, "Feels like we're building something that'll hold." I gave a small nod and handed her another row's worth of seed. Later that week, while I was cutting boards for the lean-to, she came out with a bucket of nails and set them at my feet. "You missed one," she said, tapping the split rail at the far corner. I watched her fetch the hammer without waiting for me to move. The sharp crack of nails biting into wood carried across the yard, each strike clean. She met my eyes afterward and said, "It's better now." The evenings were warmer, and we left the window above the bed cracked to let the air in. Mara slept easy beside me, one hand sometimes resting against my chest. When she stirred in the night, I could tell it was from a dream, not the cold. In the morning, she never spoke of it, and I didn't ask. Midway through April, she leaned against the porch rail, her gaze on the tilled rows. "Silas," she said, "I think I'm pregnant." The words were plain without tremor. I set down the pail I was carrying and met her eyes. "You sure?" She nodded. "I've missed 2 moons. I just know." I stepped up, cupped her face, and kissed her forehead. "Good," I said. "Real good." We didn't talk about it much in the days that followed, but I found myself watching her more when she worked. She moved slower, and I picked up what she didn't finish. In the evenings, she'd sit on the porch with her mending while I closed up the barn. The light caught her hair, and now and then she'd glance over, a quiet knowing in her expression. One afternoon she asked, "You remember the first time you saw me?" I said, "At the trading post." "You didn't look at me," she said. "I looked," I told her. "I just didn't stare." Her needle paused over the cloth. "That saved me," she said. I shook my head. "You saved yourself." I just opened the door. That night we lay side by side, the quilt pulled high against the cooling air. "You think this baby will be like us?" she asked. I turned toward her in the dim. "I hope not," I said. "But if they are, they'll have a place, a home, a name." She pressed her forehead to my shoulder. "I didn't think I'd get any of that." "You did." I told her because you stayed. By the end of the month, the rose had sprouted fine green shoots. Mara walked the furrows barefoot, her skirt brushing against the young plants, one hand resting low across her middle. She didn't look like a woman who had fled anything. She looked like she had arrived. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the ridge, I spotted a dust plume far down the basin road. It moved slow but steady, too deliberate to be wind. I stayed on the porch until the light faded enough that the figure blurred into the trees. Whoever it was, they were heading this way. By late afternoon, the sky had gone that pale, washed-out color that comes before a chill wind. I was hauling the last bucket from the well when a lone rider crested the far rise. The figure moved at a steady pace, not hurried but sure in direction. I set the bucket by the porch and waited until the horse closed the distance. The man was tall and weathered, his beard streaked with gray clothes carrying the dust of miles. He dismounted, slow boots sinking in the softening ground. "Name's Elias Ward," he said, tipping his hat. "Been on the trail out of Cold Creek. Thought you ought to know Burke Garrison's gone. Packed up and left for Denver. No one's looking your way anymore." Mara had stepped into the doorway, one hand resting against the frame. Her eyes stayed on Elias, her face unreadable. "That all I asked him?" He nodded. "Figured you'd want it straight." He mounted again, gave a short wave, and turned back toward the ridge. We watched until the dust from his horse faded into the horizon. Inside, Mara moved to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down without speaking. After a long moment, she said, "It should feel like a weight's gone. But it doesn't. Not all the way." I leaned against the counter. "Maybe because you've been free longer than you knew." She met my eyes at that something steady passing between us before she looked away. The next day we worked in the garden, pulling weeds from the rows, just starting to show green. She moved slower, one hand resting at her side. "I'm not afraid of him anymore," she said quietly, almost to herself. I didn't answer. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of fresh-turned soil and pine. We stayed out until the light began to fade, the shadows stretching long over the field. That evening, after supper, I found her by the window, mending one of my shirts in the fading light. "You've done more than just stay alive out here," I told her. "You've built something with me." Her hands stilled for a moment, then she nodded and went back to stitching. The days that followed were calm, but I kept an eye on the road out of habit. In the back of my mind, I knew that news travels uneven in these parts. A man could be gone from one town and still have reach in another. Mara didn't speak of it again, but I caught her glancing toward the horizon, now and then, the same way I did. On a warm April morning, we rode into Cold Creek for supplies. Folks glanced our way as we passed, their expressions mixed between curiosity and something else they didn't say aloud. At the general store, I bought nails, flour, and salt. Mara picked out fabric, pale green, soft to the touch. When we came back out, the sun was high, and the street was busy with wagons and riders. No one stopped us. No one spoke Garrison's name. The ride home was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. As the cabin came into view, Mara leaned forward in the saddle, her chin resting lightly against my shoulder. "This is the only place I want to be," she said. I reached down, found her hand, and held it there until we turned into the yard. That night, the air was warm enough to leave the window open. We lay side by side, the sound of the creek carrying in on the breeze. Mara's breathing slowed into sleep, her hand resting over mine. In the dark, I thought about the road beyond the ridge and how the next rider who came down it might not be bringing news we wanted to hear. Spring settled in for good, the air carrying that mix of thawed earth and fresh grass. The creek ran stronger with the melt, and the sound of it filled the quiet spaces between our words. Mara spent more time outside planting rows that would feed us through winter. Her hands worked steady, her shoulders no longer holding that same weight. One evening, we sat on the porch after supper, watching the last light catch the tops of the cottonwoods. She leaned back in her chair, a soft smile on her face. "I didn't think I'd get this far," she said. I looked out over the yard we'd built together, the cabin, the fence lines, the smoke curling up from the chimney, and told her, "You're not just here. You're home." News traveled now and then of folks moving on, of changes in the towns nearby, but Garrison's name never came up again. Whatever hold he once had, it was gone. In his absence, the land seemed quieter, the nights easier to rest through. The danger had passed, but the memory of it kept us careful. We found our days falling into a rhythm that felt right. Mornings started with coffee by the fire, evenings ended with the lantern low and the sound of crickets. There were still fences to mend, storms to brace for, and lean months to plan around. But the work was ours, and so was the peace that followed it. By midsummer, the fields were green, the air sweet with the smell of hay. We rode into town for the harvest social, and this time Mara walked through the crowd without a single wary glance over her shoulder. Folks nodded, some even stopped to speak, and she met them with her chin up. Later that night, riding back under a sky thick with stars, she rested her head against my arm. "I used to think surviving was the same as living," she said. "But it's not." I told her she was right. Surviving was holding on. Living was what we had now. Life on the frontier never promised ease, but it offered something better to those willing to fight for it, a place to stand, a name you could keep, and a home that couldn't be taken. That was our justice. That was enough. If you've ever carried a burden like that, you know the worth of setting it down. And maybe you know someone who needs to hear that it's possible. Share this with them, let them know the trail can lead somewhere good.